My First Bible presents Moses and the Burning Bush. After a long journey, Moses was able to escape from the Pharaoh, and he made it to a land called Midian. There, Moses laid down near a well to rest. At that moment, 7 young girls arrived who sought to get water from the well to give to their sheep. However, the shepherds who then got there mistreated them and stopped them from drinking water from the well. "The well is ours. Get away from here," they said. "The well is our father's. It doesn't belong to you," they responded. Watching everything that was happening, Moses decided to intervene to help the young ladies and defend them from the shepherds. Then, he helped the girls take water out of the well and give the sheep a drink. The girls were the daughters of a priest in Midian named Jethro. Jethro was Hebrew, but he was a good man who loved God very much. When his daughters made it home, Jethro asked them, "Why have you come back so soon?" "Because an Egyptian stranger helped us and got rid of the shepherds for us. He even got water out of the well for the flock to drink," they responded. "And where is this man?" he asked. "Why did you leave him alone? Invite him over to eat with us." The girls found Moses and invited him to dine with them. Jethro, seeing that Moses was a good person, offered to let him live in his house, and Moses accepted. A few days later, Moses and one of Jethro's daughters, named Zipporah, fell in love and got married. Eventually, they had 2 children. One was named Gershom, and the other Eliezer. A lot of time passed, and then the king of Egypt died, and a new pharaoh came into power. The Israelites thought they would stop being slaves, but it was quite the opposite. It turned out to be much worse.
Oh no.
They continued to be upset with their condition as slaves. They cried out to God for help. They thought that God had abandoned them. One day, on Mount Horeb, Moses was taking care of Jethro's sheep, when suddenly he saw something very strange. On a mountain, he saw a bush called bramble set on fire. Moses noted that the bush was not burning up and said, "Wow, how incredible! I'm going to see why the bush isn't burning." Then, Moses heard a voice calling to him. "Moses!" "Huh? I am here!" "Moses, don't go any closer," said the voice. "Take off your sandals, because you are standing on holy ground." "Who are you?" "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." When Moses heard this, he fell to the ground. He was scared to look at God. And God said to him, "I see how cruelly the Egyptians treat my people. The time has come to save them. I will bring them back to the land that I promised Abraham and Isaac, a beautiful land, good and spacious, a land where there is an abundance of milk and honey. I am referring to the country of Canaan. So prepare yourself to leave, Moses. I am sending you to the Pharaoh, so that you may free my people, the Israelites, from Egypt." Moses said to him, But, who am I? I'm not important enough to tell the Pharaoh to let our people leave Egypt. I will be with you. But the Israelites won't believe that I'm speaking for you, said Moses. What will I say to them if they ask me what your name is? What will I respond? God said to him, I am who I am. That is my name. I am has sent me. That's what you will say to the people. Tell them that the God who chose them as a special people has sent you. Moses did not feel ready to do what God was asking of him. He tried to come up with many excuses. What if they don't believe me when I tell them who you are? Then what do I do? The Israelite elders and leaders will believe you, said God. And to prove that I am with you, ask the Pharaoh to all you to take my people to the desert for a 3-day journey to worship me. I know very well that the Pharaoh will not accept this. So then, I will show my power by punishing all the Egyptians.
Oh.
Moses said, but what if they still don't listen to me? God asked him, what do you have in your hand? My rod, he answered. Throw it to the ground, he said. Moses let it fall to the ground, and it transformed into a serpent. Moses tried to run away from it, but God commanded him to grab it by its tail. When Moses grabbed the serpent, it once again turned into the rod in his own hands.
Wow.
Now, bring your hand to your chest. Moses brought his hand to his chest, and when he took it off, his hand was covered with leprosy. Bring it to your chest again, insisted God. Once again, Moses brought his hand to his chest, and when he took it off, it was on the rest of his body.
Oh.
If the first miracle isn't enough to make them believe you or listen to you, said God, then maybe they'll believe you with the second. Oh, Lord, I'm not good at talking. I am slow to speak and clumsy with my tongue. It is very difficult for me to talk, insisted Moses. Moses tried to come up with all the excuses imaginable so that God would send another person. Moses! God became angry with Moses and said, I will send your brother Aaron. He will meet you and go with you. He is a good talker. Aaron will speak to the people for you. You will tell him everything I say to you. Don't forget to take that rod with you, because with it, you'll perform miraculous signals. Finally, Moses did not have any excuses left. He obeyed God and left from there. He took his family, said goodbye to his father-in-law.
Okay, bye.
Moses and his family began the journey back to Egypt. Moses carried a rod in his hand, which would be the tool God would use to demonstrate his power to the Israelites and Egyptians.
After meeting with the Israelites to let them know that God had heard their cries and was coming to their rescue, Moses and Aaron delivered God's message to Pharaoh. Let my people go. But Pharaoh refused because God had hardened his heart. Instead of showing mercy, Pharaoh was cruel and made the work and lives of the Hebrew slaves even more difficult than before. The showdown was at hand between God and Pharaoh. Who was the true king? Who was all-powerful? Whose command could not be ignored? God told Moses not to fear, but instead prepare to witness his mighty power as he forced Pharaoh to let his people go. The next morning, Moses again came to Pharaoh, and again Pharaoh refused to let the Hebrew people go. So, at the Lord's command, Moses told Aaron to stretch his staff over the Nile River, and the waters turned to blood, causing the fish to die and the waters to become undrinkable. But Pharaoh's heart hardened further, so God sent a second plague. This time, frogs covered every inch of the land. This became so unbearable that Pharaoh begged Moses and Aaron to make this plague stop. The morning of the following day, Moses returned to Pharaoh and commanded him to let God's people go. And again, Pharaoh refused. God had Aaron strike the dust with his staff, and gnats swarmed the land, covering both people and animals. When Moses came to Pharaoh again the next day, Pharaoh again refused Moses' request to let the people go. In response, God sent a fourth plague, flies. Like a black cloud, flies covered every part of Egypt, except where the Hebrew slaves lived, spoiling the land and entering every Egyptian's house, including Pharaoh's palace. Once again, Pharaoh pleaded with Moses and Aaron to end this plague. God sent Moses to Pharaoh again, but Pharaoh still refused to listen to God. The next day, God sent a severe plague upon the Egyptians that killed their donkeys, camels, herds, and flocks. This hardened Pharaoh's heart even more against God. Again, God sent Moses to Pharaoh. When Pharaoh refused God's command yet again, Moses threw soot into the air, and it became dust that covered the land of Egypt, causing all the people in Egypt to break out into painful sores. Pharaoh's heart, hardened by God, made it so he continued to disobey God's command to let the Hebrew people go. God told Moses to go back to Pharaoh and warn him that the coming plagues would be much more destructive and harsh than the last. But Pharaoh still wouldn't listen. When Moses stretched his hand toward heaven, God sent a hailstorm unlike any that had ever been seen before in the land. It destroyed plants and homes and killed animals and people. Pharaoh confessed that he was wrong, but again his heart hardened, and he rejected God's command. Then God sent a plague of locusts. These insects covered the land and devoured the last remaining plants and trees in Egypt, leaving the once lush farmland surrounding the Nile a barren desert wasteland. Pharaoh was still unwilling to release God's people, so at God's command, Moses stretched his hand up to the sky, and a heavy darkness swallowed Egypt. For 3 days, no Egyptian saw another person or left their house. Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron so he could try to make a deal to end the plague of darkness. Pharaoh said everyone could go to worship the Lord if all the Hebrew people left their flocks and herds behind. When Moses and Aaron refused this offer, Pharaoh commanded them never to come back or they would be killed. With the people still enslaved, God told Moses there would be one final plague, a plague so severe Pharaoh would have no choice but to free God's people. God told Moses that throughout the land of Egypt, every firstborn boy would die. God told Moses to tell the Hebrews to cover the doorposts of their homes with the blood of a lamb, and God would pass over their homes. At midnight, the firstborn sons in every Egyptian household died, including Pharaoh's own son. From the lowliest of servants to Pharaoh's palace, there was no home in Egypt untouched by death. This plague so devastated the land of Egypt that Pharaoh commanded God's people to leave. The Hebrews, who had been in slavery for generations, had been set free.
Hurried as fast as they could and left that night. They didn't know exactly where they were going, but God promised that He would show them the way. He sent a huge cloud for the Israelites to follow during the day and a giant pillar of fire to guide them and keep them warm at night. Every day, God led the Israelites through the desert until finally they reached the edge of the big sea. But then, in the distance behind them, they could see Pharaoh and his army chasing after them. Pharaoh had changed his mind again, and he wanted the Israelites back. God's family was trapped. The Egyptian army was behind them, but a giant sea was in front of them. The sea was too deep to walk or swim through, and they didn't have boats. There was nowhere else to go. But Moses told the people, "Don't be afraid. The Lord Himself will fight for you. You need only to be still." Kids, would you trust God if He told you to be still, even if it didn't make sense to you? Well, God caused a giant cloud to move behind the Israelites, to hide them from the Egyptians. He told Moses to pick up his staff and raise his hand over the sea. Then God sent a strong wind to blow over the water all night long, making a path of dry land appear at the bottom. The Israelites walked across the dry path with walls of water on each side of them. God had provided a way, just like He promised. Once the Israelites were in the middle of the sea, the Egyptians started to chase them, but God confused their army and caused their chariots to get stuck. They started running away because they realized that God was helping the Israelites. And as soon as every single Israelite had crossed to the other side of the water, God told Moses to raise his hand over the sea again, and the waters rushed back. The Israelites were safe because God had rescued them. The Israelites finally saw how powerful God was. They realized that they could trust Him and put their faith in Him. They worshiped and thanked God, singing, "The Lord gives me strength and protects me. He has saved me. He is my God, and I will praise Him." And that's the story of the Israelites.
The Jordan River stood between the Israelites and their promised land. But the same God who miraculously delivered them from the slavery of Egypt would once again make a way where there was no way. It is time for you to separate yourselves from the things of the world that hold you back from God, Joshua declared to the people of Israel, "For tomorrow the Lord will do amazing wonders before your eyes." As God had been with Moses when He parted the Red Sea 40 years earlier, the Lord promised He would also be with Joshua. Inspired by this confidence, Joshua explained the plan that God had given him. "Here's what we will do," Joshua announced. "As soon as you see the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord your God being carried by the priests, follow after it." The Ark of the Covenant was important because it held the 2 stone tablets on which God had written His law, which showed His people how to live. It also held the promise of mercy and forgiveness when they failed to do what He commanded. This special golden box was the physical representation of the living God. It held the mystery and promise of a Savior. On this day, the people of God placed all their confidence and trust in Him to deliver them, and God led them to the land He promised. When the priests who carried the ark approached the raging waters, they did not hesitate to step in. They were not afraid of what they saw with their eyes, because their focus was on the promise God had made them. With courage and determination, they stepped in. And God performed the most amazing miracle. God held back the waters of the Jordan River. From the moment the priests took the first steps into the troubled waters, they miraculously stopped flowing. Far up the river, at the city of Adam, the water piled high as though it were splashing up against an invisible wall. As planned, the priests stood on dry ground in the middle of the river and waited until all the people of Israel passed by. When the last of them had crossed safely, the priests followed behind. And when they reached the other side, God released the waters back into the river canyon as they had been before. God proved to Israel that there was no sea deep enough to hold them back from his promises. It was important that his people always remember how mighty and powerful their God was, so that they would have the strength and courage to trust him in the future. So God had one representative from each of the 12 tribes of Israel collect stones from the riverbed to memorialize this great event. One by one, Joshua placed each stone in a pile as he acknowledged God's power and goodness. In the future, when their children and their children's children looked at these stones, they would remember how God separated them from a painful past, how he built their faith and trust in his strength, how he brought terror and confusion to their enemies, and most importantly of all, this event held the promise of their final deliverance that would come through Jesus the Messiah.